Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, rejoined this week by Charlie Araujo. Welcome back.
Well, thank you. After watching Shane on stage here with you last week, I wasn't sure if I was going to be invited back. It was a great show last week. Shane's a great longtime friend of mine, and it was great to have him sit in for me. And glad that he could be here. And it turned out great too, from the standpoint that I was in Austria was meeting some clients, and we had taken a long weekend in Vienna and
Sehr
we're
gut,
supposed to
sehr
take the
gut.
train to Salzburg that day. And I don't know if you happened to see the news or how much it was here, but there were like 100-year storms going through, basically rain nonstop, and our train was canceled and had to actually rent a car and drive. It was pretty ugly. So it all definitely worked out.
I've never driven in Austria or in Germany, but I'm sure that was quite the experience. At least they drive on the same side of the road that we do, so that's helps.
It was a great trip, and despite all of that, actually the road trip we just drove straight through. And I've driven in Germany and Austria before, but it was beautiful, the Austrian Alps, and it was absolutely gorgeous. So it was at least a good drive.
Fantastic. I would definitely trade you. Right now, I'm in Vegas for NetApp Insight. And when I look outside, all I see is the torn down remains of the Tropicana, which is going to, in theory, be turned into the stadium that is stealing my Oakland A's away from me. So that's
Oh no!
fantastic.
Wow. Well, there you go. And you can have Vegas. I would trade you Topeka, Kansas for Vegas. I mean, my gosh, you can keep Vegas. But anyhow,
Yes, the
topic for
show itself
another.
is fine, as we'll talk about next week. But yeah, the Vegas itself, 90 degrees and torrid and arid.
But of course, you're there because there's always lots of tech news that comes out of Vegas and the other major spots. And you were at a big show, of course, last week that I think is going to consume probably a good chunk of today's episode.
Mhm.
And of course, we're talking about Dreamforce, which is Salesforce's big annual conference. And why don't you were there on the ground, so maybe you can start by sort of teeing it up and talk about the what was the big news that you took away, and we'll kind of dive into it.
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. Anybody who heard about Dreamforce at all ended up hearing about agents. Agentforce is the name of basically their new cloud or their dedicated business unit that is going to be providing AI agents to all. It was a huge push at the show itself. Honestly, some of the other cloud announcements and keynotes were seem to be a little deprecated, honestly, because a lot of their Sturm and Drang, their thunder and lightning and all that good stuff ended up going into Agentforce itself. There was a big push for people at the show to build their own agents on the floor. I think Jim Cramer from Mad Money even built his own agent. They were definitely trying to make sure that they showed that it was something that your average line of business person could figure out with some drag and drop capabilities and some Salesforce magic to take care of the rest. So now we've got at least one platform that will definitely allow line of business employees to build agents. That part was absolutely proven on the floor. As for what the rest of it means, well,
So I'm curious, did you try it? Did you do it yourself?
I did. And I found it was a relatively straightforward process. Honestly, it was not that different from any sort of drag and drop, combination, I would say, drag and drop analytic workflows, creation of custom objects, like anything that is like semi-difficult from a drag and drop perspective, but it was not a hard process at the end of the day.
And I guess the real question is, did that agent seem to function as you had hoped? Did you have a wow moment with the end result?
Um, I would say not really. And I don't think it was supposed to have a wow moment. It automated something and then I got a result that was semi-automated with some data. So that was okay. It did what it was supposed to do. But I think my bigger concern is now any Salesforce, I would say super user or mature user, it is probably able to create one of these with no real issues. Is that good or is that bad?
So it was a bit of it was a genuine question. I actually didn't know they had done that. So when you said that, but it was a bit of a setup insofar as that was exactly sort of my point. I had a few reactions. So the first is, we'll get to this in a second, but Microsoft, of course, had to have their counter announcement out there talking about agents, and so they have a blog that they produced talking about their agent studio. And they said something similar, that it's going to be like having a spreadsheet. And honestly, when my sort of note to myself when I was reading this article, it's like, that is terrifying as an IT person. I'm going to have tens of thousands of these agents running around, and business users just creating them willy-nilly. And I think there's all kinds of potential challenges with that. And I asked about the WoW in part because I think right now this is a classic case of a whole lot of hype, and we'll see how that actually starts playing out in reality when we start having to operationalize it. And I'm reminded of when Siri first came out, and we had people like Larry Ellison and Mark Benioff and others going out there on stage and saying, oh, look, we can ask Siri this and it will do it. It connects to our system and does all these things. And of course, none of that really ever became a reality, mostly because nobody had a use for it. So I think it's really curious. The other big takeaway I had in looking at this was a few things. One is how big of a pivot that Salesforce is making around this. They are maybe not quite betting the company, but they are coming close to how much emphasis they put on this. I also find it interesting that normally when there's a big user conference like this, they save the big announcement for the show floor, or for the rather the keynote stage. And in this case, we've been talking about Agentforce for what, a month? I mean, they telegraphed this.
It. They just threw it out there hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you and Shane were talking about it last week. I mean, so it is also really interesting, and I don't know if that's a sign that they felt they had to get in front of this, that it was more. That one I find really kind of fascinating. And then the third big sort of aha, and I know you in our free talk for the show, you mentioned that they were doing this. That when I read through all the press releases and what have you, it's like it was very clear that there is a big fat bullseye painted on the back of Microsoft as far as Salesforce is concerned for this, which is also interesting because we've talked in the past about Salesforce clearly moving more and more into becoming a data platform and having much broader aspirations than just the traditional CRM space. But this full kind of frontal assault on Microsoft, I think, is quite fascinating.
Yes, and I think the Microsoft thing comes from several different angles. First of all, that Salesforce's real growth is happening through the data cloud. We keep talking about this every quarter, that the CRM business seems to be growing about 5% per year, and the data cloud, Tableau and MuleSoft, is all growing like 20% per year. So it doesn't take a math genius to figure out which one is growing more consistently and more quickly. But I also think that there has definitely been this realization that Microsoft is taking away a lot of Salesforce's growth in certain areas, such, for instance, with Slack. What ended up killing Slack as the undisputed market leader in its space? Teams, because Microsoft was just happy to come in and pound Teams down everybody's throat and make it part of Office and just make it part of that Microsoft contract. So Salesforce knows that Microsoft has this power to basically provide services for either free or for a very low amount, and basically break up anything that Salesforce is trying to do. So I think Salesforce sees Microsoft not quite as an existential threat, but really as the big obstacle for Salesforce to monetize AI. So they are getting in front of it right now.
So that's what I find interesting about this. Is I look at ServiceNow as a much greater competitor. I look at some of the other major players as potentially large competitors here. Clearly, if you're trying to go after the AI assistant / agent space with Microsoft's Copilots, obviously, it was fascinating to see Benioff just going after the Copilot space. Like, oh, we're past the Copilot era. It's like, we haven't even started the Copilot era. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. But clearly that was this, attack on Microsoft. So in that regard, that's true. And clearly, I think there's egg on their face with Slack on how they just had their lunch taken from them with Teams. But elsewhere, I mean, there is not even a competition really with Salesforce and the Microsoft Dynamics. I mean, not really, right? There's really no competition with the Tableau and Power BI. I mean, there's really, so if I look at like the core where you see Salesforce going, I don't really view Microsoft as a primary competitor in these core spaces. But this sort of what this speaks to is that Salesforce is clearly seeing AI as sort of trumping all else
Mhm.
and wanting to go after that space. We'll see. I mean, I think I'm not sure I'm convinced that Salesforce is going to be able to win in that entirely. But I will say I think the big weakness that Microsoft has always had is that AI is data centric, and from an enterprise perspective, it's enterprise data centric.
Mhm.
And Microsoft has all of the enterprise productivity space, but really very little of the actual AI data estate other than the Azure cloud, which of course then has everything running in it.
Mhm.
And so as I look forward and say, how do I contextualize, how do I monetize and operationalize my AI platform? I do think the major players of the current sources of record, the potentially the Salesforce, the Oracle, the SAPs, the ServiceNows, are in a better position to harvest that data simply, which is where I think the don't do the DIY messaging sort of works, but there's so much ground to cover on it that this feels a little bit like AI washing in that they're just oversimplifying how hard this stuff really is.
Yeah, and with Microsoft, they might not have the easiest solutions to use, but I think Microsoft has been pushed to provide a little bit more visibility into how the data works. And they do have some of these foundational data tools such as SQL Server. It's obviously hard to do analytics without SQL, and Microsoft is able to provide a little bit of extra visibility there, where Salesforce will literally say, you don't have to worry about that engine. You don't have to worry about the analytics or how any of this is actually done, as long as we get you from start to finish and you can define the task that you want to get done. I do think that if you put uh, Satya Nadella and Mark Benioff in a pit right now, there would be some bloodshed. um, there is some definite bad blood there. But you also reminded me with ServiceNow that Benioff had a funny quip about a month ago saying that Salesforce was like McDonald's and ServiceNow was like Wiener Schnitzel. And if you haven't been to the West Coast, Wiener Schnitzel is like this hot dog chain. It's little, it's regional, it's not even In and Out. It's like it's like the next thing down from In and Out from a size and uh notoriety perspective. So yeah, like Benioff is definitely het up about this right now.
That's actually quite fascinating. Well, what I also noticed, and this may ultimately be good for Salesforce insofar as I feel like to a certain extent over the last, I don't know, 5, 8 years, they've lost their mojo a little bit, right? They very much had this we're a big giant startup kind of um, mentality that seemed to have given way over the last several years with all of the political infighting and the CEO what do you call it? Whatever, with trying to find
Post
your
CEOs that
successor.
kept
Yeah,
disappearing.
all of
Brett
that,
Taylor
all of
being
that
the
sort of drama.
latest of them. Yeah.
And I noticed on the marketing stuff that they have, if you go back to the very beginning of Salesforce, remember it had the software with the no slash through it, and they were back to having the DIY with the no slash. And this may be the galvanizing thing that helps Salesforce sort of get that mojo back. I mean, we'll see. I think I guess my big challenge and concern is that, and even with the way you described that we're doing the demos, is that this stuff is nowhere near as simple as people want to make out, as tech companies want to put out there. And all you have to do is look at the automation anywheres of the world, the RPA vendors, to see that these sort of agent based models, while can be very powerful, they take a lot of effort and work. And in fact, and I'm not sure if this helps Salesforce and Benioff or not, but CIO, maybe not coincidentally, last week had an article about in the title, I'll just read it. Think of building your own AI agents. Don't do it, advisors say. And it was referencing some data coming out of Forrester and some consultants who maybe have a vested interest in saying this is a mess, but basically talking about how for most organizations this is really challenging. So that could bode well for a Salesforce with that message of this is not DIY. But I think it also speaks to the fact that there's, in my opinion, almost as much risk in having this super simple sort of model with all this power underneath the covers. It's like putting a first-time driver behind, the seat of a Ferrari in crowded traffic. And I just, it's you're just setting yourself up. And so it was, I thought it was interesting to see these sort of all these positions sort of coalesce this week.
Yeah, with that CIO piece, I always have a little doubt about anything that says don't do it yourself and hire consultants to come in and do it instead. There's obviously a little bit of a financial interest there, but I do think there is something to the fact that people have to think about the technical debt that might happen if you suddenly dump 5,000 agents all at once, many of which might be duplicative in some way, and many of which may have different types of logic based on the individual builder. That is going to be a lot to keep track of, and it's going to end up potentially being either tribal knowledge or internal trivia that could easily go wrong without some level of governance or organization at the end of the day. And I'm not saying that the right thing is for the Salesforce admin to suddenly now be the workflow and agent police, but there has to be some way for companies to start thinking about how they are not going to get stuck into a 2024 version of their company for the rest of their lives, which I could see definitely happening if you over configure and over customize your Salesforce data through 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million agents. Maybe the same person builds the same agent 100 different times and never shuts off any of the rest. And at the end of the day, you are just stuck with not knowing which one you're supposed to use when that person leaves after a year.
Well, I call it the Lotus Notes problem. If you're old like me and you remember Lotus Notes before they got acquired by IBM, I don't think it's even still around anymore, but it was one of the very first
HCL
platforms
has them now, of all people.
Oh, okay, there you go. So, they were one of the very first platforms that a end user could kind of create their own, in this case, a database, right? It was before automation. And people would we'd wake up and find that they had thousands of these Lotus Notes databases running around, duplicative data, no idea what's on it, no governance, no controls. And in fact, as an analyst, when I've looked at low code platforms, it's always one of the first questions I ask is how do you combat this? And I think that's sort of missing right now in this whole conversation around agentic AI. In how do you provide that governance layer around it? We've talked a lot about governance in the past, but I think that, as always, the hype gets ahead of the reality and the operationalization. As I mentioned, Microsoft also had a press release and a blog post talking about unveiling what they're calling the Microsoft Copilot Studio, sort of the similar idea, slightly different approach, but this idea of building these agents that you can deploy directly into the Microsoft 365 Copilot agents or interface. And again, this idea that from within SharePoint or a business chat, you can go and start creating your own agents. And they even say in there that, I don't have the quote right here, but basically that they envision that there's going to be, thousands of these in an average organization. And again, it was like, wow, I'm just struggling with understanding how that's really the approach we should be going after here.
I'm sorry, but when you said inside SharePoint, I just had an involuntary gasp of,
right?
It's like everybody has dealt with SharePoint hell and how that has been mismanaged within a company. Like there is no non-messy version of SharePoint in an enterprise at this point.
Well, and look, I think we're going to talk in a minute here about Zoho and an announcement sort of unrelated to this, but related to this idea of democratization. And I'm a huge believer in general about democratization, getting IT out of the way, pushing data and capabilities out to the end users. And I think overall, I still land that way, even when we are talking about agentic AI. But I think that there's a rush right now to say, hey, well, look, we're bringing AI to the masses and missing, I think, really a strategic outlook on how we're going to address that. Now, on the flip side, there was one other announcement related to Salesforce, which I think speaks to the other side of it. So Alation, who is a company I know you follow fairly closely, announced that they have launched a Salesforce connector specifically to focus on data trust, right? So, and maybe you can explain what Alation does, but they're basically in the business of, correct me if I'm wrong, data governance, data lineage, this idea of how do you ensure that the data you're using is valid. And we talked about Salesforce being a data cloud, and I think this is critical. And this speaks to the bigger corporate sort of issues, what I think people have to address when it comes to AI and data. It's like, how do you actually make this stuff work and that you can trust it? And I think this is more of the approach that I think should be taken versus the sort of wild, wild west thing. So I was curious what you made of this particular announcement.
Yeah, after dogging on Salesforce for a bit, this is the area where I think does look very promising. Alation, for those of you who don't know, is a leading data catalog. They keep track of all the data sources within your organization, and then you can keep track of their names, their metadata, changes that have been made, things like that. So the fact that Salesforce is working with a vendor of this caliber in the data governance and management space is promising. I also think that Salesforce I thought it was promising that Salesforce announced that they were working with Workday and basically handling the AI automation that is happening in Workday. So honestly, anytime you have an agent that is handling all the work in Salesforce and all the work in Workday, that's a really good start for enterprise applications, because you've already got a lot of enterprises who are going to be using your solution as a default. So they're definitely pulling out all the stops to make sure that they are successful. And they are looking at the enterprise versions of data governance and management that will be appealing to an IT audience. I think the big question for Salesforce is, how do you actually manage and govern the agent creation and ongoing management process and not get overwhelmed by it?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, so going back to the Alation thing, I think this is going to sound weird because, of course, I don't know the exact numbers, but Salesforce has to be 100 times Alation size, right? They're not
Market
equals
cap
here by
wise,
any
yeah.
stretch. Yeah, but I look at Alation, and to me, this was actually a really solid like endorsement of Salesforce, right? We've talked about them being a data cloud, but they hadn't really risen to that level of, in my opinion, of being taken truly seriously as a data platform. And Alation is, when you're serious about data as an asset and looking at your data flow, you look at companies like Alation to manage that. And so the fact that this is now this integrated process and it's integrated into the data flow, I think I took as a really positive sign and a signal that you can really take this very seriously as a core data platform, not just as a shared common data platform for the Salesforce ecosystem, as an actual data platform. And I thought that was actually quite, interesting in terms of the signaling of where this is going. So, I think the only big question I have is, if I'm a CRM customer, a traditional Salesforce CRM customer, am I not going to get any attention anymore? Because that's not what the focus of the company is. I mean, that was the only well, that's kind of strange.
Right. And I think for the rest of the year, that actually kind of might be the case. There's going to be a big push for everybody to go agents, 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 AI, AI, AI.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how that plays out on the field and in the field on the ground, because sometimes what happens is all this talk, but as we've talked about, there's recent Oracle and SAP are still big giant companies because the blocking and tackling still consumes the vast amount of the resources of an enterprise IT organization. So we'll see how much of this is truly a ground shift, or how much of it's just something to kind of create some market relevance. Speaking of data, though, there was another big announcement, I guess, maybe on a different level, I suppose. But Zoho, a company we've talked to quite a bit, and I think you and I actually met at a Zoho event years ago.
Yes.
They have if you're not familiar with Zoho, they have an entire suite of 50 some odd, almost 60 now products. And one of those products is a product called Zoho Analytics, which is their sort of answer for BI tools. Although I would argue especially with this latest release, they become much more of a data platform as well.
Mhm.
And so they released version, I guess, 6.0. And in full disclosure, I have a report that is coming out on this sometime here in the next week or two. But what I love about the Zoho Analytics approach in general is that they're very, very focused on the democratization of taking something that in most organizations is limited. You got this data management function, and that's who has to manage all of this. And Zoho Analytics, I mean, Zoho focuses on more of the what I call the small to medium enterprise for this space. So smaller organizations without those resources, and they're really, really focused on making it simple and accessible. And with this release, they've continued to do that, and they've also now added all these AI elements to give a conversational layer for a bunch of pieces, and really kind of tying together the entire end-to-end data pipeline, which for a big company is something they've been able to do for a long time. For these smaller organizations, this has always been, you know, out of reach, or at least a big stretch. And so I think this is again, in this whole idea that data is driving everything, a really important move for them.
Yeah, what I really liked about the Zoho Analytics 6 launch is that how wide-ranging it is. It's kind of hard to sometimes figure out, well, is going from 5 to 6 or 5 point whatever to 6 a really big deal? But in this case, when you look at all the stuff they put in, there's data management to figure out connectors and data prep, some advanced capabilities there. They already had data prep, but they put additional data quality capabilities there. They improved their analytics and visualization a little bit, but honestly, a lot of that is commoditized at this point. They put in Python IDE, so to help with data science, they have actually they put an entire machine learning data science studio in place for the data scientists. And then they also have their AI assistant, Zoho calls it Zia, which allows you to do natural language views of information and to get actual data back. So they're going all along the entire spectrum, from data connector all the way to what we're looking at, generative AI, and it's all in one package. And I think their most expensive seat is something like $500 a month. And when you compare that to how much a data science platform normally costs, where the pricing can easily be $50,000, $100,000 a year just to get in the door, the price difference is obvious. Doing this for $6,000 a year means that now any company can legitimately get a full package that goes all the way from data management to data science and Gen AI. You can literally have your data scientists start working in Zoho, which I think is a massive cost advantage, if nothing else. That's the one thing that sticks to me, that we're talking about 5x to 10x reduction, basically a 10x, 1/10 of the cost of what it used to be.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, it's like it's not a fair comparison by design, because one of the big things I think that Zoho, and that's why I'm calling them a data. We have this argument when I brief with them, that I don't like the term analytics, because it conjures a very narrow sort of view, and they actually, to your point, it's much broader. The whole data prep and data management, and I mean the entire thing. And it's really, they are truly an end-to-end. I mean, the entire data pipeline, all the way through the data science components, can be managed in their platform. And that's actually really hard to do, especially as you're dealing with bigger environments where you now need sort of this next layer of complexity and scalability that you really don't need when you're talking about maybe a smaller enterprise organization. And so they're able to sort of kind of bring it to that level. And we talked previously about democratization. And it's really interesting. Clearly, they have the studio that is designed for data scientists, but I would argue they're definitely making a play for this idea of the citizen data scientist. And unlike the unfettered thing we were just talking about, where you just have this wild, wild west, where you just have Joe Blow user out there doing it, this is still designed for somebody who understands data architecture, who understands the building blocks of what they're trying to achieve from a business perspective. And now they're giving tools where they don't have to actually become a Python expert to do this, or as they develop those Python skills in the code studio, or skills in the code studio, they can start doing some of it. So I thought it was just really interesting. And the last little thing that I was sort of harping on them about is that one of the things that I don't think Zoho, are talking nearly enough about is that all of this agentic AI, all of these different forms of AI that we're talking about unleashing in the enterprise, they all are reliant on having a really robust data architecture that you can trust, data that you can trust at its core. And that's the blocking and tackling that Zoho Analytics is going to help its customers do with this tool. And so the pathway to AI are things like this. And they're not talking about, in my opinion, that enough. But I think it's a really solid release. And if I kind of compare and contrast to what we're hearing from the Salesforces of the world, right? You have the way up here, that's great. But if you're a $800 million company that looks at that and goes, well, that's all really big and really expensive and really complex, what do I do? I think Zoho Analytics suddenly becomes a very viable option.
Yeah, and I also think that when you look at the legacy analytics players like SAS or MicroStrategy or TIBCO, when you if you're using one of those and you're locked into this multi-million-dollar contract, you have to at least start looking at something like Zoho and think, wow, I could cut my software costs by literally 90% and still get the exact same capabilities that I'm probably using most of this for. I'm probably the one exception would be TIBCO has really great logs and real-time data that Zoho hasn't quite figured out yet. But with just about everything else, where if you've already got predictive analytics and reporting and data science and an AI assistant from this vendor that you can work with, and you might already be using their CRM or some of their finance or other software capabilities, it seems like a no-brainer to at least try it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about sort of advanced and I guess I can't really call it newer anymore, but the more modern technologies, Kubernetes, of course, is finally, I think, starting to see greater traction within the realm of the traditional enterprise. Still, probably not as much as I think some of us expected. But as that happens, we're seeing continued increased focus on cost. As one of the companies that I have done some work with, actually, I guess I haven't really technically worked with them, but that I've been following fairly closely is a company called Perfect Scale. They're pretty focused on this because as organizations start going down this road, they start recognizing that you've got these challenges of managing performance and cost. And to that end, IBM has gone out and, as they've been doing a lot of lately, made another acquisition, this time of a company called KubeCost. And I found it interesting, mostly because I think, I'm not sure, IBM also acquired Apptio a while back. And so I guess they're rolling this into as part of that group. I'm not sure. But I feel like IBM hasn't quite figured out their FinOps story yet. So I found this purchase an interesting one. So what was your take on it?
Yeah, so I've been following FinOps a long time. I think IBM has been making some interesting acquisitions, and I agree that it feels not fully baked from an IBM perspective, but I would say that IBM has been picking up market leaders in specific spaces along the way, including Turbonomic, Apptio with its cloudability offering, now having Kubernetes capabilities with KubeCost. They have their own internal IBM Concert capability, which also tracks software and cloud activity. And it seems like, and then they have Instana as well, their observability platform. So they have all these pieces of the puzzle where you can tell, if you put them all together, you have this interesting cloud orchestration suite where you can look at all the activity and look at all the cost and figure out how to optimize everything. And IBM is basically your lens into multi-cloud. All the pieces of the puzzle are there. And whether they can put it together, that's going to be the interesting question. I would say that I think it's promising that they basically kept most of the Apptio team together, and the Apptio team has obviously been very focused on this multi-cloud challenge for a long time. So I think that, like most IBM acquisitions, the real challenge here is, can you keep the original team on board, and can you let them continue to be entrepreneurial? When IBM does that, like they did with Red Hat, things tend to work out well. When IBM kind of tries to take things over, like they kind of did with Cognos and SPSS and some of these acquisitions from a decade ago. We've seen what happens to those acquisitions over time.
I think the challenge I have is Red Hat is the big exception when it comes to IBM's acquisition track record. And I agree, Red Hat. I mean, Red Hat is to a certain degree the tail wagging the dog now. But I think with maybe from fear of some of the past blunders, they have taken a more hands-off approach with a lot of their acquisitions and leaving them mostly intact. But I think the challenge with that is exactly what you were saying at the beginning. Is like I mean, yeah, I look at the observability space as an example, and they have like 4 different companies that do pieces of it, and they haven't really coalesced it into a unified platform, story, message, any of it. It's just like these building blocks. And going back to the DIY, it's sort of up to you to put these together. And so then what's the advantage of having it all under one brand? And that I'm sort of concerned here from a FinOps perspective, of the same thing. So, I'm a big fan. I mean, here's what I'm gratified by. I believe that the companies that are out there and trying to look at cloud cost universally, I think are missing the boat, right? Kubernetes has very distinct set of characteristics that require a whole different way of looking at cost management. And I think you have to look at performance, which I don't think KubeCost does as good of a job as they should. But you have to be able to look at the balance between performance and cost around the two. And so I am gratified that they're recognizing that having a specific play around Kubernetes is important. But the challenge with that is Kubernetes is this, at least from a traditional enterprise perspective, a small little sliver, which means I have to put it together as part of this bigger picture. And I mean, if anyone should be able to help me do that, it would be an IBM, and I don't see them doing it. So.
Yeah, we'll see what ends up happening. But I think this also means that there are a few other Kubernetes cost specialists that are out there. There are obviously features in the big picture, not full-fledged platform. So they've either got to figure out the rest of cloud FinOps, or they've got to get acquired. I think being acquired is probably more likely. And honestly, there are several other FinOps companies that could probably use a Kubernetes specific solution to help with the extremely variable and time sensitive issues that are associated with assigning anything to Kubernetes, where you could choose different resources at any time and have all sorts of problems. I'm here at NetApp, and we'll see what NetApp ends up doing from a Kubernetes perspective, whether they're happy with the current observability capabilities or whether they want to go deeper into cost. But we're seeing that VMware, the market leader in the FinOps space, obviously having its challenges. Let's just put it that way. We know all parts of VMware either being tossed off or dealing with partner issues or having to explain for whatever Broadcom is doing to them, and that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. So between IBM buying up stuff and VMware falling apart, this market is very much in flux right now.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of flux, I suppose there's another one. I'm going to let you lead this one because you had some interesting points on it. But I guess Tidelift, who a company I'm
Yes.
not familiar with, has a new study talking about open source and how it's maintained. So why don't you tee that one up?
Yeah, so I find Tidelift, they're an interesting little company founded by former Red Hat executives. Of course, Red Hat has been the voice of enterprise open source for a long time. So these people come from that background, and they realized that when you look at the open source world, that a lot of these projects are not maintained, including projects that are being used in enterprise software or being used by large enterprise IT organizations to handle important automation or other technical tasks. So they created this company where they basically said, we'll find these projects that don't have maintainers, and we will show that these opportunities are available, and then we can find maintainers for them. Or if you're already maintaining a project and not getting paid for it, maybe we can get you paid by the people who are actually depending on this little piece of technology to work. So anyways, that's the company. And they do this report every year on the state of the open source maintainer, basically showing what are hundreds of maintainers actually doing in their day-to-day lives. And as you might expect, this report shows that the majority of maintainers are not being paid for their work, including for open source projects that are currently being used to support enterprise grade work. So you might think that's a problem if these pieces are dependent on people who are doing this for fun and have no contractual actual need to support this, and no skin in the game in actually making sure this gets done other than for their own personal self-interest.
Well, when I looked at this, my big takeaway is this is why I've never been a big fan of open source, and why I think, in fact, most CIOs don't actually use true open source, right? They use Red Hat, right? They use something where it's like it's open source, but it's a
With
paid
corporate
engagement for
maintainers, yeah.
support, yeah, for this very reason. Now, so to me, I look at this and it was sort of a. I actually didn't. I appreciate the background. I didn't understand that's what Tidelift was all about, so that's kind of interesting. But I look at this, and from a core enterprise perspective, like, okay, whatever. I mean, it solidifies what I've long said. It's like you should never be doing true open source in a production environment. What is more interesting from my perspective, and we've talked about this in the past with a couple of different incidents, is it's the open source that sits in sort of the public internet, and a lot of the like core parts of this really deep underlying infrastructure that's where I think some of these impact. So it's not like within the bounds, the walls of an enterprise, but the stuff that the enterprise inadvertently or almost subconsciously is reliant on could be vulnerable to this. And I think this may actually lead to some upswell in how do we address this. So it's interesting from that perspective, but definitely questions that if you're a CIO you should be at least aware of and be asking.
Yeah, and I think that's the big issue here. I think simply being able to ask that question and having that bill of materials for every piece of software that you're using in your organization, and knowing that you are not either leaving your software to be broken or to be hacked. Because do you really know who is maintaining that open source component that you're reliant on? There's a lot of doors that open doors potentially into your organization that you're not even considering if you haven't done this type of audit. And I'm not saying this would be easy to do, because honestly, there's a lot of unmanaged open source that is just hiding there, and that is hard to even detect in the first place.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And I think what is interesting is the environment, I think, keeps getting harder. We've talked in the past about the fact that we live in a hybrid IT world, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. And it's interesting. You pointed out or found this article from CIO Dive that talked about this. I guess there was some hearings in the UK by regulators that were sort of challenging the competitiveness. And what was really the sidebar that sort of came out of this is that AWS, and I guess also Microsoft to a degree, they sort of backed this up, saying that one of their greatest competitive threats is in fact the repatriation. Now, we've talked about this in the past, but this is probably the first time, at least I've seen, a public acknowledgement from the major hyperscalers that they're seeing that, and they're seeing it significantly enough. Now, I'm not sure this whole hearing was, it's in their best interest in the case of this hearing to kind of say, hey, we have lots of competition. So,
Yes.
who knows? But I do think it's interesting because I certainly on the ground am hearing this with CIOs that I talk to, that this is a common thing. We're asking every single workload, where should it live? The translation is that it really complicates the active management, right? That I'm dealing with multiple clouds. In case almost everyone I talk to now is dealing with at least two, if not three, of the major cloud providers. Plus, they have some on-prem, maybe some colo. I mean, it's this really complex environment now. So I found it interesting, mostly from the standpoint that it's just this sort of public recognition of something that we've been talking about, and just speaks to the fact that I think this is the normal for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I've definitely seen the same thing over the past couple of years, that there's interest in repatriation, and it's not everybody leaving the cloud full scale. Obviously, the cloud is still growing 20% a year and will probably do so for the foreseeable future. But it does mean that people are looking at some of those Amazon bills or Snowflake bills or Microsoft bills or Google Cloud bills and wondering if they can do better, especially for some of these dedicated workloads. That is not a secret. And the fact that even Amazon can actually point to specific cases that are relatively large as repatriation issues speaks to the fact that this is a real thing. Even if, yes, Amazon said this because they don't want to be called a monopoly and regulated as one in the UK. That's the real reason they said this. But that aside, there is actual competition for the cloud for a lot of workloads right now, and people are starting to realize that there are still a lot of data center and infrastructure pros out there, and that perhaps hosting a server on-prem is not as difficult as we made it out to be a decade ago when we said everything had to go to the cloud or else you would completely go bankrupt and be dead as a company.
So I actually didn't bring this article up. I probably should have, because you just said something that sort of light bulb. Because I agree. Like I said, I think we're going to be in this space for a long time. But one of the reasons, one of the pushes to the cloud was in fact just that, this fight for talent. And what is interesting, and I don't remember, I think it was a Wall Street Journal report, was talking about how we're actually, for the first time in probably a decade and a half, actually seeing real significant challenges for IT staff. If you're not focused on AI today, right? We're seeing sort of that pullback. And what that means is if you're a CIO at a traditional enterprise, you suddenly have the opportunity to pick up some of this staff to manage some of the repatriation, and potentially people that have come from the major tech companies where they actually have this experience. So we could actually see this talent flow back in traditional enterprises to the extent that they want to be building those capabilities, which could be interesting, which leads to the last story, I guess, of the day, also about Amazon. And I'm really curious your take on this. And the news is that Andy Jassy, the CEO of Amazon, has come back out now publicly and said, and I forgot what the time frame is, but very soon, I think at the beginning of the next year, that everybody needs to be back in the office full time. No more remote work, as a matter of course, or as a matter of standard practice. And that, we've certainly seen that out of JP Morgan Chase and a few others, but I think this is the first major tech company that has gone that hard. I could be wrong on that, but clearly they're one of the most influential. And I think it's really, really interesting, and may exacerbate or maybe speak to the fact that they don't feel like they're in such a fight for talent that they can get away with doing that. I was curious what your take is on this.
Well, it's definitely been a trend over the past year or so that the likes of Google and Meta and Salesforce have all asked people to come in, if not every day, at least 2 or 3 days a week instead of 0 days a week. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is that there is pressure just from a real estate perspective to bring these workers back to these urban areas that had been built out for those workers, just the restaurants and dry cleaners and whatever shoe repair services that had been in these offices or in these areas that now are threatened to go out of business. I think that's one little piece of it. But I think the most important part is, honestly, some of these companies are trying to lay off employees and find ways to push employees out without having to actually declare a layoff or to do any other thing that might be seen as attacking workers. If you instead put in this policy and 10% of your most highly paid labor that you might not actually need right now in-house ends up leaving, that might be a win-win for everybody involved.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. Of course, they're couching it in the need for collaboration and culture and trying to be the world's biggest startup and all of that. And I think there's a degree of to which I agree with that, in that, I know I get sort of an energy boost when I come together and I'm physically co-located with people, but I don't know that it's necessary all the time. And clearly, they were one of them. I think they were on a 3-day-a-week mandate is what they were on. And so this is, going back. And like I said, I'm not sure if they're the only ones, but what I think is interesting more than anything is that if there is any group, at least from a technology perspective, that can manage remote work, it is tech companies, right?
A cloud company, yes.
Right. We have the technology. We spend most of our time sitting at a laptop. We're doing that work anyway. And so I do find it interesting, and I do think you could be right. I think we're definitely seeing a flip of the labor market. Um, and I personally, as someone who's worked remotely for 25 years, I actually think it's not the right move overall, but I guess we'll see. I think we may be seeing tech companies moving more in this direction, and I I think it's fascinating because I was in the camp that said the pandemic had permanently shifted this dynamic, and
Mhm.
I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, I think it's a stupid power move, quite frankly. I have seen enough startups in my day that are fully or mostly remote. They could be headquartered out of Montana or Israel or Singapore or whatever. And they'll say, yeah, we have 3 people in our main office and then another 17 who are, I honestly don't even know where. And we are working together on this thing. It is extremely common in the tech world. And if you really want to be a tech startup, or the biggest tech startup, you should act like actual tech startups in the modern world, which honestly are distributed and can be managed well on a distributed fashion. I think people are either saying at Amazon, I don't know how to manage a distributed team, in which case you probably shouldn't be a manager in the first place, or I'm playing some sort of other power move because it is good for me politically. But this is not something that is actually good from a work productivity perspective. The end, full
So
stop.
So I know we're running long, but I'm really curious your take because those are strong statements. And I've been a long fan of Andy Jassy and a long fan of Amazon, of AWS in particular, which of course Andy Jassy headed up until he became the CEO of Amazon overall. So what's your take on this? Is that, have they lost their mojo on this and are just wrongheaded, or do you think he's authentic in that this is really about collaboration and culture?
I honestly feel like this is something political that I have no visibility to. Maybe he's getting pushed by his board. Maybe there's a bunch of middle to high level executives who are insisting that they need their people in the office for some reason. All I all I know is that in the real startup world, this is not an issue. Real startups look for talent wherever they can get them, and you create processes and feedback mechanisms to manage your remote team. And it's not difficult, and there's been a long held playbook for this type of management at this point. So I just don't buy the excuse that they're providing. Maybe there is a real reason that is economically sound or is important from a business perspective, but being the world's largest startup is not it.
Well, what I think is funny is going back to the last article that we were covering about the risk of repatriation of workloads. The big holdup, in my opinion, has been having the talent that actually understood it, and they may end up releasing intentionally or inadvertently a bunch of qualified talent that can help these large enterprises do this
Yep.
repatriation. So we'll see how that plays out. But it's going to be another interesting week as always.
Yeah. Well, at least we got to end on some hot takes. and,
Exactly.
and with that, always great to talk to you. If of course, please like, subscribe, comment, let us know what you thought, and we look forward to talking to you next week.